The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the abandoned trading post, its wooden walls weathered grey from decades of desert winds. Samuel Hartwell pulled his horse to a stop beside the crumbling structure, dust swirling around the animal's hooves as it stamped impatiently. The year was 1873, and the frontier was a harsh mistress that showed no mercy to those who couldn't adapt to her unforgiving ways. Samuel dismounted slowly, his weathered hands gripping the saddle horn as his boots touched the parched earth. At 52 years old, the rancher had seen more tragedy than most men could bear in 2 lifetimes. His once prosperous cattle ranch had been reduced to nothing more than charred remains and bitter memories after an Apache raid 6 months prior. His wife Martha and their 2 young sons had perished in the flames, leaving Samuel with nothing but the clothes on his back and a burning desire for something he couldn't quite name. Perhaps redemption, perhaps simply a reason to continue breathing. The trading post had been abandoned for weeks, maybe months. Scattered debris told the story of another violent encounter between settlers and the Apache tribes, who had called this land home long before white men arrived with their dreams of manifest destiny. Samuel kicked at a broken wagon wheel, watching it roll a few feet before settling into the dust. He had come here hoping to find supplies, maybe trade his remaining possessions for enough food to last another week. As he approached the main building, something caught his attention. A wooden crate sat in the shade of the collapsed awning, partially hidden beneath fallen timber and debris. What made it remarkable wasn't its presence. Abandoned goods were common at these forsaken outposts, but the crude lettering burned into its side. Apache property. The words had been branded deep into the wood with what appeared to be a hot iron, the letters dark and permanent against the sun-bleached surface. Samuel's heart began to race as he heard something that made his blood run cold, the faint sound of crying. Not the wailing of the wind through broken boards or the call of a desert animal, but the unmistakable whimper of a human child. His hands trembled as he pushed aside the debris, revealing more of the crate. The crying grew louder, more desperate, as if sensing his presence. With tremendous effort, Samuel lifted the heavy wooden planks that had fallen across the crate's lid. The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to stretch across the entire desert. Samuel's calloused fingers found the edge of the lid and pried it open with a creaking groan that echoed through the empty trading post. Inside the crate, wrapped in what appeared to be traditional Apache blankets and animal skins, lay a child who couldn't have been more than 2 years old. The little girl, for Samuel could see now that it was indeed a girl, had dark hair and skin bronzed by the desert sun. Her eyes, large and fearful, stared up at him with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. She had been crying, but now she lay perfectly still, as if assessing whether this bearded stranger represented salvation or further danger. Samuel's breath caught in his throat. In all his years on the frontier, he had never encountered anything quite like this. The child was clearly of Apache heritage, but her presence in a crate marked as such suggested a story far more complex than a simple abandonment. Someone had taken great care to ensure she was protected. The blankets were of fine quality, and despite her obvious hunger and thirst, she appeared unharmed. "Easy there, little one," Samuel whispered, his voice rough from disuse and emotion. He had not spoken gently to anyone in months, and the words felt foreign on his tongue. "I'm not going to hurt you." The child continued to stare at him with those impossibly large, dark eyes. Samuel noticed that despite her obvious Apache features, there was something else in her appearance. Perhaps a mixing of bloodlines that spoke to the complex relationships that existed on the frontier, relationships that polite society preferred not to acknowledge. Samuel looked around the abandoned trading post, trying to piece together what might have happened here. Scattered around the area were signs of a hasty departure, overturned tables, scattered goods, and the telltale marks of wagon wheels heading north toward the nearest settlement. But there were no bodies, no blood, no obvious signs of violence. It appeared as though everyone had simply packed up and left in a hurry. As he examined the scene more carefully, Samuel began to notice details he had initially missed. Near the crate, partially buried in the dust, lay a piece of paper. He picked it up and brushed off the dirt, revealing handwriting in English that was clearly educated but hurried. The note was brief and cryptic. Her mother was white, father unknown, Apache raised, tribes moving north, cannot take, may God forgive us all. Samuel read the note twice, then looked back at the child who was now sitting up in the crate, her small hands gripping the edges as she watched his every movement. The implications of the note were staggering. This child was caught between two worlds, part white, part Apache, accepted fully by neither. Someone had made the agonizing decision to leave her behind, perhaps hoping that fate would be kinder than the alternatives that awaited her if she remained with the tribe. The rancher's mind raced with possibilities and questions. Who were her parents? How had she come to be with the Apache? And why had they chosen to leave her here, in this desolate place, rather than take her with them as they moved north? The answers to these questions might never be known. But one thing was certain. This child's very existence challenged everything Samuel thought he knew about the rigid racial boundaries that governed frontier life. Samuel knelt beside the crate and extended his hand slowly toward the child. She flinched initially, then seemed to reconsider, reaching out with tiny fingers to touch his weathered palm. Her skin was soft and warm, and Samuel felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced since losing his own family. A protective instinct that transcended race, politics, and the bitter history between whites and Apache. "What am I supposed to do with you?" he asked softly, though he knew the child couldn't understand his words. Even as he spoke, however, Samuel found himself already knowing the answer. He couldn't leave her here to die. Despite everything he had lost, despite the hatred that had consumed him since the raid that destroyed his life, he couldn't abandon this innocent child to the merciless desert. Samuel looked around the trading post one more time, searching for any additional clues about the child's origins or the circumstances that had led to her abandonment. In the main building, he found evidence of recent habitation: cold ashes in the fireplace, empty food containers, and sleeping areas that suggested multiple families had taken shelter here temporarily. This had likely been a way station for travelers, both white and Apache, despite the tensions that officially existed between the two peoples. The more Samuel investigated, the more he realized that the frontier was not the simple black and white world of conflict that newspapers back east portrayed. Here, in the harsh reality of daily survival, people made alliances and formed relationships that would have been scandalous in more civilized settings. The child in the crate was living proof of these complex interactions, a bridge between worlds that might otherwise remain forever separated by mistrust and violence. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Samuel made his decision. He couldn't restore his lost family, couldn't undo the tragedy that had shattered his previous life, but he could save this one small life. Perhaps in doing so, he might find some measure of redemption for the hatred and desire for revenge that had been consuming him since Martha and his boys had died. Samuel carefully lifted the child from the crate, wrapping her securely in the Apache blankets. She was lighter than he had expected, clearly undernourished but not critically so. Someone had been caring for her until very recently. As he held her against his chest, she looked up at him with those penetrating dark eyes, and Samuel felt as though she was somehow looking directly into his soul, seeing past his gruff exterior to the broken man beneath. "I guess you're coming with me," he said quietly, surprised by the gentleness in his own voice. "Lord knows I don't have much to offer, but it's got to be better than this place." The child made a small sound, not quite crying, but not contentment either. It was as if she understood, on some primitive level, that her life had just taken a dramatic turn. Samuel gathered up the blankets and what remained of the supplies in the crate, noting that whoever had left her had included a small leather pouch containing what appeared to be traditional Apache remedies and herbs. As Samuel prepared to leave the trading post, he took one last look around the abandoned settlement. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the constant whisper of wind through the broken building. This place had once been a hub of activity, a meeting point between two different ways of life. Now it stood as a monument to the fundamental conflicts that were tearing the frontier apart. Samuel mounted his horse carefully, holding the child securely against his chest with one arm while gripping the reins with his free hand. The horse, a steady mare named Belle, who had been his companion through countless difficult situations, seemed to sense the importance of her precious cargo and stepped carefully as they began their journey towards Samuel's temporary camp several miles to the south. As they rode through the desert landscape, Samuel found himself studying the child's face, searching for clues about her heritage and background. Her features were a fascinating blend, the high cheekbones and dark coloring of her Apache ancestry, but also something else, perhaps the softer lines inherited from her white mother. She was beautiful in a way that would likely make her life complicated as she grew older, caught between two worlds that had little tolerance for those who didn't fit neatly into established categories. The child fell asleep against Samuel's chest as they rode, lulled by the steady rhythm of the horse's gait and perhaps exhausted by her ordeal. Samuel found himself studying her peaceful face, marveling at the trust she was showing by allowing herself to sleep in the arms of a stranger. It occurred to him that she might not even remember her birth parents. If she had been with the Apache since infancy, they would have been the only family she had ever known. This realization brought with it a heavy sense of responsibility. Samuel was not just rescuing a child from abandonment, he was potentially severing her connection to her cultural heritage and identity. The Apache who had raised her were now gone, moved on to whatever uncertain future awaited them in the north. If Samuel took her into white society, she would likely never have the opportunity to learn about her Native American heritage or understand the traditions that had shaped her early life. As the sun began to set, painting the desert sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, Samuel reached his temporary camp, a small grove of cottonwood trees near a reliable water source. He had been living here since losing his ranch, existing day to day while trying to decide what to do with the rest of his life. The camp was sparse but functional, with a lean-to shelter, a fire pit, and basic supplies stored in waterproof containers. Samuel dismounted carefully, still holding the sleeping child. As he settled her on a pile of blankets near the fire pit, she stirred and opened her eyes, looking around the unfamiliar surroundings with alert curiosity. Samuel could see intelligence in those dark eyes, an awareness that seemed remarkable for someone so young. "You must be hungry," Samuel said, though he knew she couldn't understand him. He had some jerky and hardtack in his supplies, but nothing that seemed appropriate for a small child. As if reading his thoughts, the child made a small sound that might have been hunger or simply a response to his voice. Samuel rummaged through his supplies, eventually finding some dried fruit that he thought might be suitable. He offered a piece to the child, who examined it carefully before taking a tentative bite. Her face brightened slightly, perhaps the first positive expression Samuel had seen from her, and she began to eat more eagerly. As Samuel watched the child eat, he found himself thinking about his own sons and how they might have reacted to finding themselves in such circumstances. Tommy, his youngest, would have been curious about everything, asking endless questions about where they were going and what was going to happen next. Michael, the older boy, would have been more cautious, studying the situation carefully before deciding whether to trust this new arrangement. The memory of his lost family brought a familiar ache to Samuel's chest, but for the first time in months, it was tempered by something else, a sense of purpose that he had thought was gone forever. This child needed him, and perhaps more importantly, he found that he needed her as well. She represented hope in a way that he couldn't fully explain, a chance to build something positive from the ashes of his previous life. As darkness settled over the desert, Samuel built up the fire and prepared for the night. The child seemed fascinated by the flames, watching them dance with wide eyes. Samuel wondered what memories the fire might trigger for her. Had she sat around similar fires with her Apache family, listening to stories and songs that connected her to generations of tradition? The thought made Samuel realize that he knew virtually nothing about Apache customs or child-rearing practices. He had always viewed the Apache as adversaries, people to be feared and fought rather than understood. Now, faced with caring for a child who had been raised in that culture, he found himself wishing he had made more effort to learn about their ways of life. Samuel pulled out the leather pouch that had been left with the child, examining its contents more carefully in the firelight. Along with the herbs and traditional remedies, he found small objects that appeared to have ceremonial significance: a tiny carved animal, some polished stones, and what looked like a miniature version of a traditional Apache amulet. These items had clearly been chosen with care, representing someone's attempt to preserve at least some connection to the child's cultural heritage. As the night grew colder, Samuel wrapped additional blankets around the child and settled down beside the fire to keep watch. She had fallen asleep again, her small body curled up like a cat, seeking warmth and security. Samuel found himself studying her peaceful face in the firelight, marveling at the circumstances that had brought them together. The desert night was filled with its usual sounds: the distant cry of coyotes, the rustle of small animals moving through the brush, and the constant whisper of wind across the sand. Samuel had grown accustomed to these sounds during his months of solitary existence, but tonight they seemed different somehow, less lonely, and more like a natural symphony accompanying the beginning of a new chapter in his life. Samuel's thoughts turned to practical matters as he sat by the fire. He would need to find a more permanent place to live, somewhere that could provide better opportunities for raising a child. His temporary camp was adequate for a solitary man living day to day, but it was no place to raise a little girl who would need education, social interaction, and stability. The nearest town was Prescott, about 3 days' ride to the northeast. It was a rough frontier community, but it had a school, a church, and at least the semblance of civilized society. Samuel had avoided towns since losing his family, preferring the solitude of the wilderness to the well-meaning sympathy and awkward conversations that awaited him among people who had known Martha and the boys. But now, everything had changed. This child would need more than Samuel could provide alone. She would need to learn to read and write, to function in the white society that would likely be her only option for integration. The Apache bands that had raised her were gone, dispersed by military pressure and the relentless westward expansion of white settlers. Even if Samuel could locate them, returning her to that life might not be possible or safe. As Samuel pondered these challenges, he became aware that the child had awakened and was watching him from her nest of blankets. Her dark eyes reflected the firelight, and there was something in her expression that seemed almost adult-like in its seriousness. It was as if she understood on some level that her entire world had changed and that her future now depended on this bearded stranger who had found her in a wooden crate. "Can't sleep either?" Samuel asked softly, knowing she couldn't understand his words, but hoping his tone would be comforting. The child made a small sound in response, not quite a word, but clearly an attempt at communication. Samuel found himself wondering what language she had been learning to speak. Had her Apache caregivers been teaching her their native tongue, or had they perhaps been preparing her for eventual integration into white society by emphasizing English? The note left with her had been in English, suggesting that at least some of the people involved in her care were literate in that language. The complexity of the child's situation was becoming more apparent with each passing hour. She was not simply an orphaned Apache child who could be easily placed with another tribal family, nor was she a white child who could be seamlessly integrated into frontier society. She was something entirely unique, a living bridge between two worlds that were often at war with each other. Samuel realized that raising this child would require him to confront his own prejudices and assumptions about Apache culture and people. The hatred he had felt since the raid on his ranch was still there, burning in his chest like a physical pain. But looking at this innocent child, he found it impossible to maintain that hatred in its pure form. She had done nothing to deserve his anger, and the Apache who had raised her had clearly cared for her deeply. As the fire burned lower, Samuel added more wood and settled back against his saddle to try to get some rest. The child seemed to have fallen asleep again, but Samuel found his mind too active for sleep. He kept thinking about the note that had been left with her. Her mother was white, father unknown, Apache raised, tribes moving north, cannot take, may God forgive us all. The phrase, "May God forgive us all," suggested that whoever had written the note understood the moral complexity of their decision. They had not abandoned the child callously or without thought. They had wrestled with their choice and found it wanting, but had seen no better alternative. Samuel found himself wondering about the circumstances that had led to such a desperate decision. Had the Apache band been under military pressure, forced to move quickly with no time to care for a child who might slow them down? Had there been conflicts within the group about keeping a child of mixed heritage? Or had there been more personal reasons, perhaps the death of her primary caregivers, leaving her without advocates within the tribal structure? These questions might never be answered, but they highlighted the precarious nature of life on the frontier, where survival often required impossible choices, and where the consequences of those choices rippled outward in ways that could never be fully predicted or controlled. Samuel's thoughts were interrupted by a sound from the child, not crying, but a soft murmur that might have been an attempt at speech. He looked over to see her sitting up, looking around the camp with alert curiosity. Despite the dramatic changes in her circumstances, she seemed to be adapting with remarkable resilience. "You're a tough little one, aren't you?" Samuel said quietly. "You're going to need to be where we're going." As if in response to his words, the child crawled over to where Samuel was sitting and settled herself against his side, her small body seeking warmth and security. The gesture was so natural and trusting that Samuel felt his throat tighten with emotion. When was the last time another human being had sought comfort from him? When had he last felt needed or valued as something other than a source of labor or military capability? Samuel carefully wrapped his arm around the child, feeling the steady rhythm of her breathing as she settled against him. For the first time in months, he felt something resembling peace. The rage and despair that had been his constant companions since the raid began to recede, replaced by a sense of purpose that was both familiar and entirely new. The child fell asleep again, and Samuel found himself finally able to rest as well. His last conscious thought was a recognition that tomorrow would bring new challenges and decisions that would shape not just his own future, but the future of this remarkable little girl who had entered his life in such an extraordinary way. The desert night continued its ancient rhythms around them, predators hunting, prey hiding, the eternal dance of survival playing out under stars that had witnessed countless similar scenes of human struggle and adaptation. But for Samuel and the child, this night represented something different, the beginning of a bond that would be tested by the harsh realities of frontier life, but which might, if they were fortunate, provide both of them with the family and belonging they had lost. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky with the first hints of light, Samuel stirred from his fitful sleep to find the child already awake, sitting up and looking toward the horizon with an expression of alert attention. There was something in her posture that reminded Samuel of wild animals scanning for danger, a wariness that seemed natural to her, perhaps learned during her time with the Apache, or perhaps simply an innate survival instinct. Samuel sat up and stretched, feeling the familiar aches of sleeping on hard ground. The child turned to look at him, and for a moment their eyes met in what felt like a moment of mutual recognition and acceptance. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. "Well, little one," Samuel said as he began to stir up the fire for breakfast, "I guess it's time to figure out what happens next." The child watched his movements with intense concentration, as if trying to learn and understand everything about this new world she had entered. Samuel found himself moving more slowly and deliberately than usual, partly to avoid alarming her, and partly because he was beginning to understand that every action he took was now being observed and absorbed by someone who would use these observations to make sense of her radically changed circumstances. As Samuel prepared what passed for breakfast, more jerky, dried fruit, and water from his canteen, he found himself talking to the child, even though he knew she couldn't understand his words. There was something comforting about hearing a human voice in the vast silence of the desert, even if it was his own. "We're going to have to head into town soon," he told her as he offered her some fruit. "I don't have nearly enough supplies to keep us both fed out here, and you're going to need things I can't provide. Proper food, clean clothes, maybe even a real doctor to make sure you're healthy." The child accepted the fruit and began eating with the same focused attention she brought to everything else. Samuel noticed that she ate slowly and carefully, as if food were precious and not to be wasted. This suggested that her Apache caregivers had taught her good habits, but it also hinted that food might not always have been abundant. As the sun rose higher, bringing with it the promise of another scorching day, Samuel began to pack up the camp. He would need to make some decisions soon about their immediate future, but first he wanted to return to the trading post to see if there were any other clues about the child's background or any supplies that might be useful. The child watched his preparations with growing alertness, perhaps sensing that they were about to move again. When Samuel brought Belle over and began to saddle her, the child showed no fear of the horse, another indication of her Apache upbringing, as horses were central to Plains Apache culture, and children would have been exposed to them from an early age. Samuel carefully lifted the child and settled her in front of him on the saddle, wrapping her securely in blankets to protect her from the sun. As they began the ride back to the trading post, Samuel found himself wondering what name she had been given by her Apache family, and whether he would ever know what it was. The question of names led to larger questions about identity and belonging that Samuel knew would become increasingly important as the child grew older. Should he try to preserve her connection to Apache culture, or would it be kinder to help her integrate fully into white society? Could she ever truly belong in either world, or was she destined to remain forever between them, accepted by neither? These were questions that Samuel couldn't answer alone, and he suspected that the child herself would ultimately have to find her own way through the complex maze of identity and belonging that defined life on the frontier. All he could do was provide her with the tools and opportunities she would need to make those choices for herself. As they approached the trading post, Samuel slowed Belle to a careful walk, scanning the area for any signs that others had arrived since his departure the previous day. The place appeared as abandoned as before, but Samuel had learned to be cautious during his months of solitary existence. Danger could appear suddenly on the frontier, and he now had more than just his own life to consider. The child seemed to recognize the place where Samuel had found her, turning in the saddle to look back at the wooden crate that still sat in the shade of the collapsed awning. Samuel wondered what she was thinking. Did she remember being placed in that crate, or had she been too young and frightened to form coherent memories of the experience? Samuel dismounted and carefully lifted the child down, setting her on the ground where she could see everything that was happening. He had decided to include her in his activities as much as possible, partly to help her learn about the world she would be entering, and partly because he sensed that she was intelligent enough to benefit from observing and understanding adult activities. Samuel spent the next hour conducting a more thorough search of the trading post, looking for anything that might provide additional information about the child's background or anything useful for their continued survival. In the main building, he found a small cache of supplies that had been overlooked in the hasty departure. Some canned goods, a few articles of clothing, and most importantly, a small bag of flour that would allow him to make proper bread for the child. The child followed Samuel around the trading post, staying close but showing no signs of fear or distress. If anything, she seemed curious about the place where she had been found, examining everything with the same intense attention she brought to all her observations. Samuel found himself wondering what the world looked like through her eyes. How did a child of her background and experience interpret the abandoned buildings, scattered debris, and signs of hasty departure? As Samuel prepared to leave the trading post for the final time, he took one last look at the wooden crate that had contained the child. On impulse, he decided to take it with them. It was the only physical connection to her past that would travel with them into her new life, and Samuel sensed that someday she might want to know exactly how and where her new life had begun. Loading the crate onto Belle proved challenging, but Samuel managed to secure it behind the saddle with rope and leather straps. The child watched these preparations with apparent approval, as if she understood that the crate represented something important about her own story. As they rode away from the trading post, Samuel found himself looking back one final time at the place where his life had taken such an unexpected turn. Less than 24 hours ago, he had been a broken man with no purpose beyond mere survival. Now he was responsible for a child whose very existence challenged everything he thought he knew about the world. The irony was not lost on Samuel that the Apache, whom he had blamed for destroying his previous family, had now provided him with the opportunity to create a new one. Life on the frontier was full of such contradictions and unexpected reversals, where enemies could become allies and tragedy could transform into hope in the space of a single day. As they headed toward Prescott and whatever future awaited them there, Samuel found himself talking to the child about the landscape they were passing through, the animals they saw, and the plans he was beginning to form for their life together. She listened to his words with the same intense attention she brought to everything else, and Samuel began to suspect that she was absorbing far more than he might have expected from someone so young. The sun climbed higher as they rode, and Samuel made sure to stop frequently to give the child water and rest. The desert was unforgiving to everyone, but particularly dangerous for small children who could become dehydrated quickly. Samuel found himself adopting the protective instincts he had thought were buried with his own sons, constantly monitoring the child's condition and adjusting their pace and route to ensure her safety and comfort. By midday, they had covered several miles toward Prescott, and Samuel began to look for a place to rest during the hottest part of the day. He found a small grove of mesquite trees that provided adequate shade, and dismounted to give both Belle and the child a chance to rest. As they sat in the shade, sharing water and dried fruit, Samuel found himself studying the child's face once again, marveling at the blend of features that told the story of her complex heritage. She was going to be a beautiful woman someday, but Samuel was already beginning to understand that her beauty might prove to be as much a burden as a blessing in a society that had rigid ideas about racial purity and social hierarchy. The child seemed content to sit quietly in the shade, but Samuel could see her constantly observing everything around them. The movement of leaves in the breeze, the tracks of small animals in the dust, the distant call of birds. Her awareness of her environment was remarkable, suggesting that her Apache upbringing had taught her to pay attention to details that many white children would never notice. As they rested, Samuel found himself thinking about the practical challenges that lay ahead. He would need to establish some kind of legal guardianship of the child if he wanted to enroll her in school or make medical decisions on her behalf. But what legal status could a child of unknown parentage and mixed heritage claim in Arizona territory? The bureaucratic complexities were daunting, but Samuel was determined to find a way through them. More immediately, he would need to find work that could support both of them, while still allowing him to care for a small child. His skills as a rancher were valuable, but most ranching operations required long hours and extended periods away from home base. He might need to consider other options, perhaps work in town, that would allow him to be more available to meet the child's needs. The child stirred and made a small sound that brought Samuel back to the present moment. She was looking at him with those remarkable dark eyes, and Samuel had the distinct impression that she was trying to communicate something specific. He wished he knew even a few words of Apache language that might help them understand each other better. "What is it, little one?" Samuel asked gently. "What are you trying to tell me?" The child pointed toward the horizon, where a small dust cloud suggested the approach of other travelers. Samuel's hand instinctively moved toward his rifle as he scanned the approaching group, trying to determine whether they represented friend or foe. On the frontier, survival often depended on making such assessments quickly and accurately. As the travelers drew closer, Samuel could see that it was a small wagon train, perhaps 3 or 4 families heading west with their possessions loaded into canvas-covered wagons. They appeared to be ordinary settlers rather than military personnel or hostile forces, but Samuel remained cautious as they approached. The lead wagon pulled up near Samuel's resting spot, and a middle-aged man with a weathered face and kind eyes called out a greeting. "Afternoon, friend. Mind if we water our animals at that creek?" Samuel nodded and stood up, lifting the child so she could see the newcomers clearly. "Of course. Plenty of water for everyone." The man's eyes widened slightly when he saw the child, clearly noting her Apache features and the unusual circumstances of her presence with a white man. But he was polite enough not to ask direct questions, instead focusing on the practical business of caring for his animals and families. As the wagon train settled in for their own midday rest, Samuel found himself drawn into conversation with several of the travelers. They were German immigrants, he learned, heading west to California, where they hoped to establish farms in the fertile valleys they had heard described in letters from relatives who had made the journey earlier. The presence of other families, particularly children, seemed to energize the little girl Samuel had rescued. She watched the activities of the wagon train with intense interest, her eyes following the movements of the other children as they played games and helped with camp chores. Samuel realized that this might be her first exposure to white family life, and he wondered what she was learning from her observations. One of the German women, a motherly figure named Greta Weber, approached Samuel with a warm smile and curious eyes. "Your daughter is beautiful," she said in accented English. "She has such intelligent eyes." Samuel felt a complex mix of emotions at hearing the child referred to as his daughter. He had not yet fully processed his own relationship to her, but the assumption felt both natural and slightly overwhelming. "Thank you," he replied simply, not bothering to correct the woman's assumption about their relationship. Greta studied the child with the experienced eye of a mother who had raised 6 children of her own. "She seems healthy, but perhaps a bit thin. How old is she?" "I'm not entirely sure," Samuel admitted. "Perhaps 2 years, maybe a bit older. It's complicated." Greta nodded with the understanding of someone who had seen enough of frontier life to know that complicated family situations were more common than simple ones. She reached into her wagon and pulled out a small cloth bag. "I have some things that might help," she said, offering the bag to Samuel. "Clothes that my youngest has outgrown, and some herbs that are good for children." Samuel accepted the bag gratefully, touched by the woman's kindness. The frontier could be harsh and unforgiving, but it also had a way of bringing out generosity and mutual aid among travelers who understood that survival often depended on helping one another. As the afternoon wore on, Samuel found himself enjoying the company of the other travelers more than he had expected. It had been months since he had engaged in normal social interaction, and he realized how much he had missed the simple pleasure of conversation and shared experience. The child seemed to be enjoying the social interaction as well, though she remained close to Samuel and continued to observe rather than actively participate. Samuel noticed that she was particularly fascinated by the other children, watching their games and activities with an intensity that suggested she was trying to understand the rules and patterns that governed their behavior. When it came time for the wagon train to continue on their journey, Greta Weber approached Samuel one final time. "You seem like a good man," she said quietly, "and that little girl is lucky to have found you. But raising a child alone on the frontier, it's not easy, especially for a man." Samuel nodded, appreciating both her concern and her directness. "I know. I'm still figuring out what to do." Greta studied his face for a moment, then reached a decision. "We are planning to winter in Prescott before continuing on to California in the spring. If you're heading that way, perhaps we'll see you there. My husband Wilhelm is a skilled carpenter, and I know something about teaching children. If you need help or advice..." "Thank you," Samuel said, meaning it. "That's very kind." As the wagon train pulled away, leaving Samuel and the child alone once again in the desert, Samuel found himself feeling more hopeful about their future than he had since finding her. The encounter with the German families had reminded him that there were good people in the world, people who would judge him and the child based on their character rather than their circumstances or appearances. The child watched the departing wagons until they disappeared over a low rise, then turned back to Samuel with an expression that seemed almost wistful. Samuel wondered if she was thinking about the families she had just observed, comparing them to whatever memories she might have of her own Apache family. "They were nice folks, weren't they?" Samuel said, as he prepared to resume their own journey. "Maybe we'll see them again in Prescott." The child made a small sound that might have been agreement, then allowed Samuel to lift her back onto Belle's saddle. As they continued toward Prescott, Samuel found himself thinking about the German woman's words regarding the challenges of raising a child alone on the frontier. Greta Weber had spoken from experience, and her concern had been genuine. Samuel knew that his decision to take responsibility for this child would require him to make fundamental changes in how he lived and what he prioritized. The afternoon sun was beginning to lose some of its intensity as they rode through a landscape of rolling hills, dotted with scrub brush and occasional stands of pine trees. The child had grown quiet again, perhaps tired from the excitement of meeting the wagon train, but Samuel could feel her alert presence against his chest as she continued to observe everything around them. Samuel began to talk to her about what they might expect in Prescott, partly to help her prepare for another new environment and partly to organize his own thoughts about the challenges ahead. "It's going to be different from anything you've known," he told her. "Lots of people, buildings, noise. Some folks might not understand about you and me being together, but we'll figure it out." The child tilted her head back to look at him when he spoke, and Samuel was struck again by the intelligence in her dark eyes. There was something almost uncanny about the way she seemed to understand the emotional content of his words, even if their literal meaning was beyond her comprehension. As they crested a small hill, Samuel caught sight of something that made him rein Belle to a sudden stop. In the distance, perhaps half a mile away, he could see smoke rising from what appeared to be a small homestead. The smoke was thick and black, suggesting that whatever was burning was not a controlled fire, but something more serious. Samuel's first instinct was to avoid potential trouble by taking a different route, but something about the quality of the smoke and the absence of any signs of human activity around the homestead made him reconsider. If there were people in trouble, his conscience wouldn't allow him to simply ride past without offering help. "We're going to take a little detour," Samuel told the child, as he guided Belle down the hill toward the source of the smoke. "Might be folks who need help." As they drew closer, the details of the scene became clearer and more disturbing. The homestead consisted of a modest wooden house, a barn, and several outbuildings, but the barn was completely engulfed in flames, and the house showed signs of damage. More troubling still, Samuel could see no signs of the inhabitants, no people fighting the fire, no animals in the nearby corrals, no indication that anyone was working to save what could be saved. Samuel approached the homestead cautiously, his hand resting on his rifle while his eyes scanned for any signs of danger. The child seemed to sense the tension in his posture and grew very still, her own eyes wide as she took in the scene of destruction. As they rode into the farmyard, Samuel's worst fears were confirmed. Near the front porch of the house lay two bodies, a man and a woman, both clearly dead for some time. Samuel's jaw tightened as he recognized the signs of violence that had preceded their deaths. This had been no accident or natural disaster, but a deliberate attack. Samuel dismounted carefully, making sure to position himself so that the child couldn't see the bodies clearly. "Stay right here," he told her firmly, his voice carrying an authority that she seemed to understand even without words. "Don't look around, just watch me." Samuel approached the bodies cautiously, his rifle ready in case whoever had done this was still in the area. The man appeared to have been in his 30s, probably a farmer trying to build a life for his family on the frontier. The woman was younger, perhaps pregnant based on her appearance. Both had been shot, and from the condition of their bodies, Samuel estimated that the attack had occurred sometime the previous day. A thorough search of the area revealed no other bodies, but Samuel found evidence that suggested this had been a family with at least one child. Small clothes hanging on a line, toys scattered in the yard, and a child's bed in one of the rooms of the house. The absence of any small body suggested that if there had been a child, they had either escaped or been taken. Samuel felt a familiar rage building in his chest as he surveyed the scene of senseless violence. This was exactly the kind of tragedy that had destroyed his own family, the random brutality that seemed to be an inevitable part of frontier life. But looking back at the child sitting quietly on Belle's saddle, he forced himself to push down the anger and focus on practical matters. The barn was beyond saving, but the fire didn't appear to be spreading to other structures. Samuel used water from the homestead's well to wet down the house and outbuildings, working quickly to prevent the flames from consuming everything. The child watched his activities with her usual intense attention, and Samuel found himself explaining his actions as he worked. "Sometimes people do terrible things," he told her as he carried another bucket of water, "but that doesn't mean we stop trying to help when we can. These folks are beyond help now, but maybe we can save something for whoever comes looking for them." As Samuel worked to contain the fire, he kept alert for any signs that the attackers might return or that other travelers might approach. The isolated location of the homestead meant that help was unlikely to arrive soon, and Samuel had no desire to become the next victim of whatever violence had struck this place. When the immediate fire danger had passed, Samuel faced a difficult decision about the bodies. He couldn't leave them exposed to scavengers, but he also couldn't afford to spend hours digging proper graves when he had a child to care for, and unknown dangers potentially lurking in the area. In the end, he did what he could, dragging the bodies into the root cellar and covering them with blankets he found in the house. As he worked, Samuel found a few items that might prove useful: some food supplies that had survived the attack, a small amount of money hidden in a coffee tin, and most importantly, some children's clothing that might fit his young charge. He also found a family Bible with names and dates written in the front cover, providing him with the identities of the victims, Jacob and Mary Henderson, married 3 years earlier in Kansas. The discovery of the Bible made the tragedy more personal and more heartbreaking. These had been real people with hopes and dreams, not just anonymous victims of frontier violence. Samuel found himself wondering about their story. What had brought them to this remote location, what they had hoped to build here, and what had happened to their child. Samuel was preparing to leave the homestead when he heard something that made his blood run cold: the sound of riders approaching at a gallop. He quickly mounted Belle and positioned himself so that he could see the approaching group while keeping the child as safe as possible. 4 men on horseback crested the hill and rode hard toward the homestead, their weapons drawn and their faces grim. Samuel's heart sank as he recognized them as a type he had encountered before: rough men who lived by violence and opportunity, the kind of predators who thrived in the lawless spaces between civilization and wilderness. The leader of the group, a bearded man with cold eyes and a face marked by old scars, pulled his horse to a stop about 50 yards from where Samuel sat. Well, he called out in a voice that carried a mixture of amusement and menace. "Looks like we got ourselves a witness to our handiwork." Samuel kept his rifle ready, but tried to project calm confidence rather than fear or aggression. "I'm just passing through," he said evenly. "Don't want any trouble." The scarred man laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Trouble's what we specialize in, friend, and you picked a real bad time to come visiting." His eyes shifted to the child sitting in front of Samuel, and his expression grew more interested. "That's a mighty pretty little girl you got there. Indian, ain't she?" Samuel felt his grip tighten on his rifle as every protective instinct he possessed surged to life. "She's my daughter," he said with quiet firmness. "We're heading to Prescott." "Your daughter?" The man's grin became more predatory. "Funny thing about that. See, we've been looking for a little Indian girl that went missing from a trading post a few days back. Heard tell she might be worth something to the right people." Samuel's blood ran cold as he realized that these men knew about the child's origins and might have been involved in whatever circumstances had led to her abandonment. The implications were staggering. Had they been responsible for forcing the Apache to abandon her? Had they been tracking her even as Samuel had found and rescued her? "I don't know anything about that," Samuel said carefully. "Found this child abandoned and couldn't leave her to die." The scarred man nudged his horse a few steps closer, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "See, that's where you and me got a problem. That little girl represents money to us, and we don't take kindly to folks interfering with our business arrangements." Samuel's mind raced as he tried to assess his options. 4 armed men against 1, with a small child to protect, were not good odds under any circumstances. But Samuel had been in desperate situations before, and he had learned that sometimes survival depended more on psychology and timing than on superior firepower. "What kind of business arrangement involves abandoning a child in the desert?" Samuel asked, his voice carrying a hint of challenge despite his precarious position. The scarred man's expression darkened. "The kind that ain't none of your concern, old man. Now you can hand over the girl peaceful-like, or we can take her after we put you in the ground with them farmers. Your choice." Samuel felt the child tense against him, and he realized that she was beginning to understand the dangerous nature of their situation, even without comprehending the specific words being spoken. Her small hands gripped his shirt tightly, and Samuel could feel her rapid breathing against his chest. "The girl stays with me," Samuel said quietly, his voice carrying a finality that seemed to surprise the outlaws. "If you want her, you'll have to kill me first." The scarred man's expression shifted from amusement to irritation. "That can be arranged, old man, but it seems like a waste when we could all profit from this situation." "What do you mean?" Samuel asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Simple business proposition," the outlaw leader said with a grin that revealed several missing teeth. "That little girl's got Apache blood, but she's been raised white enough to be useful. There's folks in Mexico who pay good money for young girls like her, especially ones that won't be missed by any legal authorities." Samuel felt sick as the full implications of the man's words sank in. These were not just common thieves or even murderers. They were human traffickers who specialized in exploiting the vulnerable populations that existed in the spaces between cultures and legal jurisdictions. The child he had rescued was valuable to them precisely because her mixed heritage and uncertain legal status made her invisible to most forms of official protection. "You're talking about slavery," Samuel said, his voice tight with controlled anger. The scarred man shrugged. "I'm talking about business, supply and demand. There's always demand for young girls, especially exotic ones that can be trained up proper." Samuel's rage at the casual way the man discussed the child's potential fate was almost overwhelming, but he forced himself to remain calm and think strategically. He was outnumbered and outgunned, but he had 2 potential advantages. The outlaws wanted to take the child alive, which limited their options for dealing with him, and they clearly underestimated his determination to protect her. "How much?" Samuel asked suddenly, causing the outlaw leader to raise his eyebrows in surprise. "How much what? How much is she worth to your buyers? Maybe we can work out a different kind of business arrangement." The scarred man studied Samuel with renewed interest, clearly trying to determine whether this was a genuine offer or some kind of deception. "You looking to sell?" Samuel forced himself to nod, though the words tasted like poison in his mouth. "Times are hard. A man's got to eat." The child looked up at Samuel with confusion and what might have been fear, and Samuel felt his heart break a little at the thought that she might believe he was actually considering betraying her. But he needed to buy time and create an opening, and this seemed like his best option. $500, the outlaw leader said after a moment of consideration. "That's what our buyer in Nogales pays for quality merchandise." Samuel pretended to consider the offer, while actually scanning the surrounding terrain for any tactical advantages he might be able to exploit. The homestead was situated in a small valley with hills on 3 sides, which limited escape routes, but also provided potential cover if he could reach the right positions. "That's a lot of money," Samuel said slowly. "But I've grown kind of attached to the girl. Might need some convincing." The scarred man's patience was clearly wearing thin. "Look, old man, we ain't got all day for negotiations. You want to sell? We'll pay. You don't, we'll take her anyway, and you'll be buzzard food. What's it gonna be?" Samuel could feel the child trembling against him, and he knew that he was running out of time to act. The outlaws were becoming suspicious of his delaying tactics, and their leader was clearly a man accustomed to getting what he wanted through violence. "All right," Samuel said finally, "but I want to see the money first." The scarred man gestured to one of his companions, who reached into his saddlebags and pulled out a leather pouch. "Count it if you want, but be quick about it." Samuel dismounted slowly, making sure to keep the child behind him as much as possible. As he approached the man with the money pouch, he was calculating distances and angles, looking for the moment when he might have the best chance of turning the situation to his advantage. The outlaw holding the money was younger than his leader, probably in his early 20s, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he was relatively new to this type of work. As Samuel reached for the pouch, he noticed that the young man's grip on his pistol was looser than it should have been, and his attention was divided between watching Samuel and keeping track of his companions. Samuel took the pouch and made a show of examining its contents, while actually preparing for what he knew would be his only chance to change the dynamics of the situation. The money was real, more cash than Samuel had seen in months. But he had no intention of actually completing this transaction. "Looks about right," Samuel said, still holding the pouch. "But I got one more condition." The scarred man's expression darkened with suspicion. "What condition?" "I want to know what happened to her real family, the folks who had her before you started tracking her." The outlaw leader's face twisted into a cruel grin. "You want to know? Fine. We killed most of them. The Apache who were protecting her got too attached, wouldn't sell, so we convinced them to see things our way." Samuel felt his vision narrow with rage as the full scope of these men's crimes became clear. They had not simply found an abandoned child, they had destroyed an entire family to get to her, treating human lives as nothing more than obstacles to their profit. "You murdered them," Samuel said quietly. "Business is business," the scarred man replied with a shrug. "Now enough talk. Hand over the girl and take your money, or we end this conversation permanent-like." Samuel looked down at the child, who was watching the exchange with wide, frightened eyes. In that moment, he made a decision that would define the rest of both their lives. He was not going to let these monsters take her, no matter what the cost to himself. "I changed my mind," Samuel said, dropping the money pouch and diving toward the cover of the nearest wagon wheel. The young outlaw's surprise gave Samuel the split second he needed to draw his rifle and fire. The shot took the man's center mass, dropping him from his saddle as his companions scrambled to respond to Samuel's unexpected attack. Samuel rolled behind the wagon and came up firing again, this time at the scarred leader who was trying to control his spooked horse while drawing his own weapon. The shot missed, but it sent the man diving for cover behind a water trough. The child, showing remarkable presence of mind for someone so young, had immediately dropped flat against Belle's neck when the shooting started. The horse, trained for frontier conditions, stood steady despite the gunfire, providing Samuel with mobile cover as he tried to reposition for a better tactical advantage. Samuel knew that his situation was still desperate. 3 armed men against 1, with limited ammunition and no guarantee that help would arrive. But he had achieved one important goal. He had disrupted their plan and created chaos that might give him opportunities to exploit. The second outlaw, a thin man with a pockmarked face, appeared around the corner of the burning barn with his pistol drawn. Samuel fired quickly, the bullet splintering wood inches from the man's head and sending him scrambling back to cover. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, old man," the scarred leader shouted from behind the water trough. "We're gonna make you watch while we do things to that little girl that'll give you nightmares." Samuel felt his anger surge again at the threat, but he forced himself to stay focused on tactics rather than emotion. Anger would get him killed, and getting killed would leave the child defenseless against these monsters. Samuel used the temporary lull in gunfire to check his ammunition supply and assess his tactical situation. He had perhaps a dozen rounds left, which would have to be enough to either eliminate the threat or create an opportunity for escape. The child was still lying flat against Belle's neck, showing remarkable composure under the circumstances. The third outlaw, whom Samuel hadn't gotten a good look at yet, suddenly appeared on the roof of one of the outbuildings, trying to get an elevated shooting position. Samuel spotted the movement and fired immediately, the bullet striking the man in the shoulder and sending him tumbling from the roof with a scream of pain. "That's 2 down," Samuel called out, though he knew that the wounded man might still be dangerous. "You want to be number 3? The scarred leader responded with a string of profanity that would have made a cavalry sergeant blush, followed by several wild shots that came nowhere near Samuel's position. The man's anger was making him careless, which was exactly what Samuel had hoped for. Samuel waited for the right moment, then broke from cover and sprinted toward a better position behind the stone foundation of the house. The wounded man on the ground tried to shoot at him, but was clearly too injured to aim effectively. Samuel made it to the new cover without being hit. From his new position, Samuel could see that the pockmarked outlaw was trying to flank him by moving through the ruins of the barn. Samuel tracked the man's movement and fired when he thought he had a clear shot, but the smoke and debris made accurate shooting difficult. The battle continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, with Samuel trading shots with the remaining outlaws while trying to protect both himself and the child. Samuel's military experience was serving him well. He had learned to fight efficiently and conserve ammunition during his service in the war between the states, but he knew that time was not on his side. The turning point came when the scarred leader made a tactical error, exposing himself too much while trying to get a clear shot at the child. Samuel's rifle cracked, and the outlaw leader spun around and fell, clutching his chest as blood spread across his shirt. The pock-marked man, seeing his leader fall, seemed to lose his nerve. "This ain't worth dying for," he shouted, then broke from cover and ran toward the horses. Samuel let him go, more concerned with checking on the wounded men than with pursuing a fleeing enemy. Samuel approached each of the fallen outlaws carefully, his rifle ready in case any of them were still capable of fighting. The young man he had shot first was clearly dead, and the scarred leader was dying fast from what appeared to be a lung shot. The man who had fallen from the roof was alive, but unconscious, blood pooling beneath his wounded shoulder. Samuel knelt beside the dying leader, who was struggling to speak through the blood in his mouth. "The girl!" the man gasped. "Worth more than you know. Others will come." "Who?" Samuel demanded. "Who else is involved in this?" But the man's eyes were already glazing over, and he died without providing any additional information. Samuel felt frustrated by the lost opportunity to learn more about the scope of the threat they faced, but he was also relieved that the immediate danger had passed. Samuel quickly checked on the child, who was still lying against Belle's neck but watching everything with wide, alert eyes. She appeared to be physically unharmed, though clearly shaken by the violence she had witnessed. "It's over," Samuel told her gently as he helped her sit up. "They can't hurt you now." The child looked at the bodies scattered around the homestead, then back at Samuel with an expression that seemed far too adult for someone so young. Samuel realized that she had probably witnessed violence before, during her time with the Apache, and that her composed reaction might reflect a familiarity with such situations that no child should have to develop. Samuel knew that they needed to leave the area immediately. The pockmarked outlaw who had escaped would likely return with reinforcements, and Samuel had no desire to face additional enemies in a location that offered limited tactical advantages. Samuel quickly gathered the supplies he had found in the homestead, along with the money pouch that the outlaws had brought. The cash would be useful for establishing their new life, and Samuel felt no moral qualms about taking money from men who had earned it through human trafficking and murder. As they prepared to leave, Samuel took one last look at the scene of destruction and violence. In the space of a few hours, this place had been transformed from a peaceful homestead into a battlefield littered with bodies. The randomness and brutality of frontier life continued to astound Samuel, even after all his years of experience with it. Samuel mounted Belle and helped the child settle in front of him, wrapping her securely in blankets. As they rode away from the homestead, Samuel found himself thinking about the dying outlaw's warning that others would come looking for the child. The threat they faced was apparently larger and more organized than Samuel had initially realized. "We're going to have to be very careful from now on," Samuel told the child as they rode. "There are people who want to hurt you, but I won't let that happen. I promise." The child looked up at him with those remarkable dark eyes, and Samuel thought he saw something like trust beginning to develop in her expression. They had shared their first real danger together, and both had proven themselves capable of facing it with courage and determination. As the sun began to set, painting the desert sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Samuel and the child continued their journey toward Prescott and whatever uncertain future awaited them there. Behind them, the smoke from the burned homestead continued to rise into the evening air, a dark reminder of the violence and tragedy that seemed to follow them wherever they went. Samuel knew that their troubles were far from over. The escaped outlaw represented a continuing threat, and there were apparently others involved in the conspiracy to exploit the child for profit. But Samuel also knew that he had proven something important to himself during the gunfight. His protective instincts were still strong, and he was prepared to fight and kill to defend this remarkable little girl who had entered his life so unexpectedly. The child fell asleep against Samuel's chest as they rode through the gathering darkness, lulled by the steady rhythm of Belle's gait and perhaps exhausted by the day's traumatic events. Samuel found himself humming quietly, an old song that Martha used to sing to their boys when they were frightened or troubled. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Samuel made a silent promise to the sleeping child and to his own lost family. He would protect this little girl with his life, give her the love and opportunities she deserved, and somehow find a way to build a future that honored both her Apache heritage and the realities of the white world she would have to navigate. The road to Prescott stretched ahead of them, dark and uncertain, but Samuel no longer felt like he was traveling it alone. He had found purpose again, and perhaps more importantly, he had found family. Whatever challenges awaited them in the days and years to come, they would face them together.